How exactly do we draw a connection between language and mind? Fortunately for us, this question was answered to a considerable extent through the research that took place in neurolinguistics starting from the mid-19th century. Today, my team and I will look at speech perception and word recognition through the knowledge of how language and mind work together to understand communication with special reference to mental lexicon and universal grammar. I am Sachini. I will give you an introduction of speech reception, recognition, perception and production. Then Ridmi will talk about localization and lateralization of the brain. Raini will explain speech comprehension. Nadeeshani will brief you out on mental lexicon, and Sinalie will explain to you universal grammar, which will be followed by a summarization of all the points discussed here. And lastly, an opportunity will be given for a Q&A session as well. I would like to lay the foundation for this presentation by taking you to the earliest discoveries of language-related areas in the brain. There, lesions and language impairments were closely studied to understand the link between language and mind. Then, hemodynamic approaches such as PET scans and fMRI scans were used, in which blood flow was used as a proxy. A more non-invasive method called TMS is also commonly used to understand the way language and mind are connected. Here, magnetic pulses are used to create electrical currents in certain regions of the brain. What you see on the slide are the regions of the brain that are responsible for language reception, recognition and perception. Humans primarily receive language through listening and reading. Sounds and words are initially recognized in the primary auditory area of the brain. Language perception takes place in the Wernicke's area. Finally, language production takes place in the Broca's area of the brain. My teammates will go into the details of these areas of the brain. However, for further understanding, I would like for us to look at this particular video, which compares the practical development of language in children by comparing children at the age of 8 months to the children at the age of 2 years.
Good attention to language. Baby's been paying close attention to everything that the adults are talking. And what are those adults doing? They're doing a lot of talking. One of the first things baby is paying attention to and baby thinks it's all their name. When a baby this age hears their name, they should look up. In addition, if the baby has given these interested and expect to follow commands with a gesture, come to mommy, give it to daddy. This is the age where they are able to follow those early first commands with a gesture language. They understand that.
As you saw in the first part of that video, the child was able to recognize when his name was said. And also, certain commands were perceived when they were accompanied with gestures. However, you notice that language production was at a minimum level. Now look at this part of this video.
They understand complex devices. Uh-oh. Should we wipe it out? Do you need clock to wipe this? They understand other pieces of concepts. And then in terms of their own communication, they should have a vocabulary that's 200 words and below. Demonstrate many two-word combinations, or more. It has nails. In addition, they're using that language for a wider range of purposes. Now, it's not only to make requests. It's to direct the activities of others. It's to comment. It's to say they don't want to do something. And they're bringing that language to their play as well. Play, pretend, play, believe, solve. They like fun.
As you saw, as the child turned 2 years of age, the child was able to understand many conversations and even perceive a reasonable amount of vocabulary. And on top of all of that, the child was able to produce short sentences. The reason for using this demonstration here is to show you that when a child grows, new neural connections are made in their brains, and that is the reason for the advancement of language that you saw in this video. And that is the evidence that there's a direct link between language and mind. Over to you. Vivid from my friend, I will be talking about localization and the lateralization of the brain which connect with the word perception. So localization refers to certain functions, for example, language, memory, etc. have certain locations within the brain. This idea has been supported by recent neuroimaging studies but was also examined much earlier, typically using case studies. So if I bring out one of the case studies, the Phineas Gage, who is 1848, while he was working on a rail line, he experienced a drastic accident, which a piece of iron went through his car. Although this person survived ordeal, he did experience a change in his personality, such as loss of inhibition and anger. This change provided evidence for the theory of localization, as it believed that this area which unstate damage was responsible for the personality. So, moving on to an example, at the moment I am presenting my presentation. So, while I am presenting my presentation, the Broca's area of my brain is functioning. It plays a significant role in language and it's associated with my speech production and articulation. Use words accurately in speech is attributed to this crucial area. Moving on to a small audio clip. Let's listen to this clip. I think you all recognize the two-step sound, don't you? So let's have a look. How do we recognize these sounds and translate them into speech? So actually this is a brain process. The information from left ear goes primarily to the right hemisphere and information from right ear goes primarily to the left hemisphere. And the vibrations in the air make the eardrum vibrate, and these vibrations pass through three small bones called ossicle, and from that part to the spiral structure called cochlea, and finally from that to the brain through the auditory nerve, and our brain interprets these signals as sounds. Moving on to the hemispheric lateralization. So our cerebrum can divide into two parts, the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. The two halves of the brain are functionally different, and that each hemisphere has a functional specialization. So the two hemispheres are connected through the nerve fibers called corpus callosum, which allows interhemispheric communication, allowing the left and right brain to talk to one another. Falling into the same context, while I am presenting my presentation, the left side of my brain is specialized and it's controlling my language and speech, while when it comes to the right, it's for the memory. When it comes to the memory, without looking to a script, I am able to present my presentation by memorizing the points that I have stored in my brain. Okay? So, this is a context that two hemispheres work together, but that each hemisphere has a functional specialization. Moving on to the split brain research. So let's talk about who are the split brain patients. So they are the individuals who have undergone a surgical procedure where the corpus callosum is cut. So this procedure, which separates the two hemispheres, was used as a treatment for the epilepsy. So there's a method that researchers use. A word or image is projected to the patient's left visual field, which is processed by the right hemisphere, or vice versa. After presenting the information to one of the hemispheres, the information is not transferred to the other hemisphere because of the corpus callosum is cut. So there is no communication at all, and there is no possible for one hemisphere to know what other hemisphere has learned. Taken as a whole, localization and lateralization are very interesting part, which emphasizes how the regions of our brain are functioning and the involvement of two hemispheres. So our next member will emphasize on another interesting topic. So Raini, the presentation is over to you.
Thank you, Ridmi. I would like to delve a bit more deeper into the information regarding the speech processing parts that are involved actively in the brain when speech is processed, and also the differences between the speech processing when a word is heard and when a word is read. Moving on to the first slide, this illustration with the highlighted areas of the human brain explicit the part of the brain that are actively involved in the processing of speech. The first area I'm going to talk about is this red color part, which is known as the Wernicke's area, and it is located in the left temporal lobe of the brain, and it is known as the word recognition center of the brain. And Wernicke's area is actively involved in the processing of language learning, and also this is where the comprehension of the speech taking place. Next area I'm going to talk about is the Broca's area, which is highlighted in light green color, and that is the area known as the speech production center. That area is involved in producing the vocal and sign language pattern of the speech, and also it is located in the left frontal lobe of the brain. Next, going on to the next part, angular gyrus, the turquoise colored part, is where all the information is assembled and understanding of the concept is taking place. Next part I'm going to talk about is the primary auditory cortex, this orange color part between the motor cortex and the Wernicke's area. This is where all the auditory signals are communicated and assembled and memorized. Another most important part of our brain is the motor cortex, which part is highlighted in purple color. Motor cortex control the motor movements of our body. Further describing it, motor cortex literally control the muscles of the human body. Motor cortex exists in the both hemispheres of the brain and control the opposite side of the body. Describing it more, the motor cortex that is located in the right side of the brain is responsible to controlling the muscles of the left side of the body, and motor cortex that is located in the left side of the brain is involved in controlling the muscles of the other side of the body. So motor cortex, or this part that is dark purple here, is the part that actually controlling the facial muscles of the body. And how when a word is heard and when a word is read, what are the differences when these parts working together? How these parts communicate the information between them when a word is first heard and when a word is read. Moving on to the next slide, this illustration here represents how the brain processes a word that is heard, that is read. So first of all, the signals that are received from our eyes are communicated to primary visual cortex, which is situated here, and then those visual signals will be communicated to Wernicke's area, the red color part, the speech recognition center. After those recognized signals will be forward to the Broca's area, in where the required speech patterns are going to be made and then communicated to the primary motor cortex. And primary motor cortex, through controlling the muscles of your face, mouth, lips, will be producing the speech. And when a word is heard, the signals that are received by the eardrums will be forwarded to the primary auditory cortex, which is this yellow color part, and then those signals, after recognizing as the auditory signals, will be forwarded to the Wernicke's area, the speech recognition center. After recognizing the words, the Wernicke's area is going to forward those signals to the Broca's area, in where the required vocal patterns are made, and then Broca's area forwarded those signals to primary motor cortex, and primary motor cortex, through controlling the muscles of your face, will be communicating the speech. And now I would like to over the presentation to Nadi to explain the mental lexicon and how brain retrieve and store the language that is processed. Thank you.
Thank you, Raini. Good afternoon, Ms. Nirosha, colleagues. All I know is what I have words for. Ludwig Wittgenstein. As babies, we go hear several dozen words a day, and this number accumulates to 27,000 to 35,000 words as young adults, and then it only grows up to about an average of 60,000 words by the time we hit the age 60. So the brain goes through a process of multiple tasks, multiple quick thinking tasks, and the question is how we access this one word, stores it in, and then produce speech. This is where the mental lexicon comes into play. The mental lexicon is a word processing unit. it can multitask. Every second we hear a word being spoken to us. This process this process unit holds valuable information pertaining to grammar in the form of phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics. The one job the mental lexicon has to do is take the input, the signal, communicate it to our head, and produce it as speech. So how does this happen? This is the understanding I have that this happens, is when we speak a word, there are a number of neurons that fires up in our brain that matches the signal, the phoneme sound of the word that is spoken. So as the word processes, some of the signals steps down, gets out of the way, and the signals that matches the phoneme sound in a full sound gets connected, meet at a recognition point, and voila, we have a word. One second, please. Yes. So the mental lexicon is not only equipped for us to recognize words. We can also use the mental lexicon to access it for its meanings. So if I had to speak to a baby and ask the baby to bring a ring from a playpen, the baby would go and bring a plastic ring, a rattle ring, or a toy. But as we grow older, this could mean for a girl about the ring that she got proposed by her boyfriend. Or for a woman of my age, it could be about a ring that I just took off my finger. Or for a regular bloke, it could be just a ring on a phone. However, at all these different stages, what our mental lexicon really did was take in the signal, receive it, recognize it, and produce a response meaningfully. And as you can see, this diagram, this is the mental lexicon and how complex the storage of it is. So we have the words, we have the meanings, we have the grammar rules. It's all up to us and our brain to access it and recognize it and produce speech. You might want to know what happens to the words that come into our lives on a daily basis, the new ones. To my understanding, the new words that come in as signals do not get registered in the mental lexicon right away. It gets stored in the frontal lobe, which is known as the hippocampus. And while we sleep, our brain stays up and transition all these signals through multiple entries, transition all these signals to the mental lexicon for long-term purpose. So the hippocampus stores in the information as short-term memory, and then the mental lexicon would be the area where all the storage is kept for long-term use. And so this is how you know that we don't just take words and speak, we will attach them in the way we can contextualize it with grammar rules and speak for our audience, our society in a meaningful manner. So if I had a Japanese friend of mine who comes to me and says, my boyfriend proposed to me with a ring, this gets registered in my head as her boyfriend suggested a ring to her. But since I'm multilingual, which I'm not, but if I was multilingual, I would be able to understand this in the form of context and grammar rules. So I will come back and tell my English friends, here he just got proposed and she got a ring. So this is how we access our mental lexicon for a wider language audience, and we will be able to communicate with our friends and make life easier for everyone for better communication. So that's my understanding of the mental lexicon and the process of speech. Sinalie is going to come and speak about universal grammar and conclude our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadi. I'm Sinalie. Good afternoon, everyone, ma'am. And continuing on from the mental lexicon, I'll be talking about a concept that has been very popular in the language world for decades: universal grammar. I'll be explaining the theory, its application to word recognition and speech perception, and finally, I'll be summarizing all the points that we discussed in this presentation so far. Even though all animals communicate, us humans have set ourselves apart in how we use so many different languages to communicate in our day-to-day life. This has led to many discussions and arguments on how we as a species are able to recognize and produce language so effectively. Some philosophers and linguists believe that we were born with some innate capabilities, while the others believe that during our birth and after we were born, our brain is a blank slate, much like this whiteboard right here, where experience will eventually fill up on. In 1960s, linguist Noam Chomsky observed that there was a poverty of stimulus, or otherwise known as a lack of information of the necessary grammatical structures for children to be able to produce new and unique language as effectively as they do. My fellow group member Sachini illustrated to you before, even at 24 months, how children were able to communicate and produce a range of sentences quite independently. This observation led to the hypothesis that Chomsky put forward that there was a innate structure in our brain which he later coined as the LAD, Language Acquisition Device, which he explained as an innate structure in our brain that was able to use the words stored in our mental lexicon and reuse them to make new and independent sentences. He suggested that there was a universal structure, a universal set of principles, if you will, ingrained in our brain when we were born, which later which is known as this theory of universal grammar. For example, if a child hears the sentence, the nice dogs like cats, Chomsky's theory suggested that the language acquisition device was able to sort these words into specific categories such as nouns, verbs, adjectives, etc., and that children will be able to withdraw on same words stored in these categories to make new and independent sentences, such as perhaps the scary cat chased butterflies. This concept of universal grammar gained popularity due to several factors. One was the poverty of stimulus that I talked about before, where many linguists observed that even with a lack of information, children were able to use language quite effectively. Another factor was that even with so many different methods of input, children and all of us eventually end up using the same grammatical structures. We all converge on the same grammatical structures even with so many different methods of input. It was also observed that some languages do have similar or universal properties within them, even though they are quite diverse. This led to many discussions on how universal grammar is involved in the production of speech. However, this is not to say that universal grammar is not without its fair share of criticism. One of the main arguments criticizing universal grammar was the fact that if we lose this ability to effectively acquire and produce speech as we grow older, is that ability truly innate? Was a question put forth by many philosophers and linguists. Another point criticizing universal grammar was the fact that we would have to study all the languages throughout the history of the world, the current languages that we are using, and any other languages that would emerge in the future to properly conclude whether they all share universal properties. Nevertheless, universal grammar has been at the forefront of many discussions in the language world and will continue to do so with strong advocates for both sides of this argument. In conclusion, today we have talked about how language is recognized, perceived, and produced through different brain mapping methods. We've had a view of how diverse regions of the brain associates with different psychological functions, as well as how each hemisphere is specialized for specific processes. We have looked at how the different parts of the brain works together simultaneously to process speech, as well as the mental lexicon, which stores sound inputs as words. Finally, we looked at how these inputs are organized in our brain in a manner that where we are able to make new and independent sentences through the process of processing of these words. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. Do you have any questions? Oh, sorry, this side.
Any questions?
No questions?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. Thank you so much for listening again. We hope you had a satisfactory understanding of how mental lexicon and the concepts of mental lexicon and universal grammar are involved in the recognition of words and perception of speech. Have a good day, everyone.